Dorian Price, a widowed single father and former safety supervisor, lost his career reputation and eventually his wife after exposing dangerous structural flaws during the East Vale Bridge project. His warnings were deliberately suppressed by construction magnate Victor Rohr, who ordered records altered to keep the project on schedule, allowing Dorian to be falsely blamed after a scaffolding collapse injured 4 workers. 6 years later, Victor's daughter, Celeste Rohr, inherits the company and discovers hidden evidence proving Dorian was innocent, including his original report, internal emails, and an audio recording of Victor admitting to the cover-up. Despite resistance from Rohr Meridian's board and legal team fabricated death threats against Dorian and the risk of destroying her own career, Celeste earns Dorian's trust and publicly exposes the truth. Their press conference triggers independent investigations, clears Dorian's name, reinstates his professional certifications, voids the false debt, and leads to resignations and legal scrutiny within the company. Celeste resigns, creates a labor trust for affected workers, and launches an ethical infrastructure consultancy while Dorian becomes a senior safety consultant. Together, they prove that truth, accountability, and integrity can finally repay a debt that money never could. The black sedan didn't belong on Maple Row. Everyone knew it the moment it turned onto the street. Too clean, too quiet, too certain of itself among the cracked asphalt and chain-link fences. Curtains shifted in windows. Old Mr. Garfield stopped sweeping his porch. Even the pigeons on the telephone wire seemed to pause. Dorian Price stood in his doorway, a dish towel still in his hand, watching the car stop directly in front of his house. Behind him, his 8-year-old daughter Marin pressed her face against his back and peered around his arm. The woman who stepped out wore a white blazer. No lawyers beside her, no clipboard, no contract visible in her hands. She walked up the cracked front path with the kind of steadiness that comes not from arrogance, but from someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times and was still terrified. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Dorian. "My name is Celeste Rohr," she said. "My father has died, but I came to pay his debt." The street went completely silent. Dorian didn't move. He already knew that name. He had spent 6 years trying to forget it. If you've ever believed in doing the right thing even when the system wasn't on your side, this story is for you. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's find out what that debt really was. Dorian Price was 42 years old and had the kind of face that had once been open, the kind that smiled easily at strangers, that lit up when talking about load calculations and structural integrity that made younger workers on job sites feel like they could ask him anything. That face was still there technically, but 6 years had drawn something careful over it, a guardedness that didn't come from bitterness alone. It came from having learned the hard way that trust was a currency he could no longer afford to spend freely. He lived with his daughter Marin in a narrow 2-story house on Maple Row in the Brookmere neighborhood on the outer edge of the city, where the grocery stores still had bulletproof glass at the registers, and the school buses ran late every single morning without apology. The house was clean. Dorian made sure of that. The floors were swept, the dishes washed, Marin's drawings taped in careful rows along the hallway wall. Small dignities, the kind a man holds on to when larger ones have been taken from it. 6 years earlier, Dorian had been a senior safety supervisor on the East Vale Bridge project, one of the largest infrastructure contracts the city had awarded in a decade. Funded and developed by Rohr Meridian, the construction and development conglomerate founded by Victor Rohr. It was the kind of job Dorian had worked his entire career toward. He was meticulous, credentialed, respected by the crews under him. He had a future. Then he found the problem. During a routine inspection of the East Vale structure secondary support columns, Dorian identified stress fractures in 3 load-bearing sections that had been poured using a concrete mixture that didn't meet the project's own specifications. He documented everything photographed. It filed a formal written warning with the project manager and copied the regional safety board. He requested an immediate construction halt until an independent structural review could be completed. His request was ignored. 2 weeks later, a section of scaffolding on the eastern span collapsed during a shift change. 4 workers were injured. The damage to the structure set the project back 8 months and cost the company millions. When the investigation concluded, the official report told a different story. Dorian's warning documents had vanished from the file. In their place was a narrative in which the safety supervisor Dorian Price had failed to identify warning signs that any competent professional should have caught. He was named as the primary individual responsible for the oversight failure. He was terminated the following Monday. Within 6 months, his name had circulated through every major contractor network in the region. No one would hire him. His certifications were suspended pending review. The review never concluded. It simply stayed open like a wound that was never allowed to close. The timing was catastrophic in ways that went beyond his career. His wife Alina had been in the middle of treatment for an aggressive autoimmune condition when he lost his job and with it their health insurance. Dorian sold the car. He took on roofing jobs, night shifts at a warehouse, anything that paid. He borrowed from his brother until his brother had nothing left to give. He did everything a man could do, and it still wasn't enough. Alina died 14 months after his termination in a hospital room that smelled like industrial cleaner, with Dorian holding her hand and Marin asleep in a chair in the corner. Too young to understand and old enough to remember. After that, Dorian stopped expecting anything from the world except the chance to raise his daughter without adding more damage to what she had already survived. That was the man standing in the doorway when Celeste Rohr stepped out of her black sedan. Celeste Rohr was 34 years old and had inherited an empire she hadn't asked for and a secret she hadn't known existed. Victor Rohr had died of a stroke 8 weeks earlier. Quickly and without warning, the way powerful men sometimes did, as if their bodies finally objected to carrying the weight of everything they refused to put down. He left behind a company valued at nearly $2 billion, a leather chair at the head of a boardroom table, and a locked steel safe behind the false panel in his home office that Celeste had only discovered when the estate attorneys came to inventory the property. Inside the safe, beneath a stack of old bond certificates and a photograph of Victor shaking hands with the mayor, was a manila folder, thick rubber-banded labeled in her father's handwriting, with a single word Eastvale. Celeste read everything in that folder in one sitting on the floor of her father's office, still in the black dress she had worn to his funeral reception. By the time she finished, the reception had long ended. The caterers had gone home, and the house was completely dark around her. The folder contained Dorian Price's original warning report, the one that had never appeared in the official investigation. It contained the independent structural assessment commissioned by a city engineer 2 weeks before the collapse, which confirmed every concern Dorian had raised and recommended an immediate construction halt. And it contained a handwritten memo from Victor Rohr to the project director dated 3 days before the scaffolding came down that read, "Keep the timeline. Adjust documentation after the fact if necessary. I'll manage the board." 3 sentences written by her father's hand, signed with his initials. Celeste had spent the next 2 weeks trying to find a version of what she had read that didn't mean what it clearly meant. She spoke to no one. She hired a private document examiner to verify the memo's authenticity. She cross-referenced dates, pulled archived city records, requested copies of the investigation transcript under her name as incoming CEO. Everything confirmed the same thing. Dorian Price had done his job correctly. He had identified the problem, reported it through proper channels, and been systematically erased from the record to protect the company's timeline and its public standing. Victor Rohr had known. Victor Rohr had chosen. So Celeste came to Maple Row. She came without lawyers because lawyers would have turned it into a negotiation, and this wasn't a negotiation. She came without a prepared settlement offer because a number on a page felt like an insult against what had actually been taken from this man. She came in the middle of a weekday afternoon because she couldn't sleep and hadn't been able to sleep since the night she read that folder. And waiting any longer felt like its own form of participation in what her father had done. She had rehearsed what she would say. Standing at the bottom of Dorian's porch steps, looking up at a man who held a dish towel in one hand and a lifetime of damage in his posture. She found that none of her rehearsed sentences were adequate. So she said the only true thing she had. "My father has died, but I came to pay his debt." Dorian looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't soften. It didn't harden either. It simply held the face of a man who had learned not to react to things until he understood what they actually were. "What debt?" he said quietly. Dorian didn't invite her in. He stepped off the porch and stood at the top of the steps close enough that she could see the tiredness around his eyes, the kind that sleep didn't fix. Marin stayed in the doorway behind him, watching Celeste with the open, unguarded curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to perform indifference. Celeste told him about the safe, about the folder, about the memo in her father's handwriting. She spoke carefully, without flourish, the way someone speaks when they know the words themselves are going to do damage regardless of how they are delivered. She told him his original warning report had been preserved, not destroyed. Preserved, which meant someone had kept it deliberately, either out of guilt or as insurance, and she suspected she would never know which. Dorian listened without interrupting. His jaw tightened once when she mentioned the memo, otherwise he was still. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's true," Celeste said, "and because you deserve to know it." "That's not an answer," he said. "Lots of things are true. People with your resources don't drive to neighborhoods like this one to share true things out of the goodness of their hearts. What do you want from me?" It was a fair question, and Celeste didn't flinch from it. "I want to make it right," she said. "I want to reopen the record. Have the investigation officially corrected. Have your name cleared through proper legal channels. I want the documentation that was suppressed to become part of the permanent public record. And what does Roar Meridian get out of that?" "Nothing," she said. "The company loses. The board will fight me. The stock will drop when this goes public." "I know that." Dorian studied her. Then why Celeste held his gaze. "Because my father built everything he had on what he did to you. That means everything I inherited is built on it too. I'm not willing to keep living on top of that." The street was quiet around them. Down the block a screen door banged. Somewhere a radio played through an open window, too faint to make out the song. Dorian looked at her for a long time. Then he looked past her at the sedan parked at the curb, at the clean, expensive lines of it against the backdrop of Maple Row. He looked back at her. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 8 years old. She doesn't know the details of what happened. She knows her mother is gone and that things have been hard. That's all I've allowed her to know." He paused. "If I let you open this back up, her name ends up connected to it. The press will find her. They always do." "I know," Celeste said. "I won't pretend that's not a real risk." "Then you understand why I can't just say yes to whatever you're proposing." "I understand completely." They stood in silence. Celeste didn't push. She had promised herself she wouldn't push. It was Marin who broke the stillness. She slipped past her father's arm, disappeared inside the house, and returned 30 seconds later with a glass of water, which she held up toward Celeste with both hands, and an expression of complete seriousness. Celeste took it. "Thank you," she said. Marin nodded gravely and retreated behind her father again. Dorian watched his daughter, and something behind his eyes shifted. Not toward trust, not yet, but away from the hardest version of no. "Sit on the steps," he said to Celeste. "Don't come inside, but you can talk." The conversations happened on the porch steps over the following week. Celeste came back 3 times. She always came alone, always in the late afternoon when Marin was home from school, always without paperwork or proposals. She sat on the lower step near the path. Dorian sat on the top step with his back against the post. Marin did her homework on the porch between them, occasionally inserting herself into the conversation with questions that were too precise for an 8-year-old, and that Dorian answered with the careful honesty of a man who had decided his daughter deserved the truth in age-appropriate portions. The neighborhood watched. Leon Vance, who had run the corner grocery on Maple Row for 23 years, made his opinion known on the second day. He caught Dorian alone at the register while Marin browsed the candy aisle, and he spoke quietly but without softening anything. "I've seen this before," Leon said, bagging Dorian's groceries with the slow deliberateness of a man making a point. "Different car, different suit, same story. They come in with apologies and leave with signatures. 2 years later, the whole block is re-sawned and everyone's gone." "She hasn't asked me to sign anything," Dorian said. "Not yet." Leon slid the bag across the counter. "They never ask for the thing they actually want until they've made you feel like they're doing you a favor." Dorian didn't argue. He had thought the same thing himself. What made Celeste difficult to dismiss wasn't her sincerity. Sincerity was easy to perform. It was the specificity of what she knew. She knew the exact date of his original warning report. She knew the name of the city engineer who had commissioned the independent structural assessment. She knew details that weren't in any public record, details that could only have come from documents that had been buried. That knowledge didn't prove her intentions were clean, but it proved the folder was real, and the folder was the only thing that mattered. Meanwhile, inside the towers of Roar Meridian, the situation was deteriorating. Warren Keene had been the company's chief legal officer for 19 years. He was 61, precise, and completely without sentiment about anything that threatened the organization's legal standing. Celeste had not told anyone at the company about her visit to Maple Row, but Keene had his own sources. A car registered to Celeste's personal account spotted twice in Brookmamere by a company driver who mentioned it to the wrong person. That was enough for Keene. He requested an emergency meeting and delivered his position without preamble. The Eastville matter was closed, he said, sitting across from Celeste in the glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor. Closed, legally closed, formally closed with full regulatory sign-off. If you reopen it, you are not righting a wrong. You are creating a liability that this company cannot absorb. The closure was based on falsified documentation. Celeste said that is an allegation. Warren said that you cannot make without exposing yourself personally. Exposing the board and triggering a shareholder response that will cost this company hundreds of millions of dollars in market value within 72 hours of becoming public. I'm aware of the financial consequences. Then you understand that the board will move to remove you before they allow that to happen. Celeste looked at him steadily. Are you advising me as legal counsel, Warren, or warning me on behalf of the board? Warren held her gaze. Both, he said. I'm doing you the courtesy of making sure you understand exactly what you are walking into. After he left, Celeste sat alone in the conference room for a long time looking out at the city below. Somewhere in that city, Dorian Price was making dinner for his daughter in a house that was clean despite everything that had tried to make it otherwise. She picked up her phone and sent him a message. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon, same time. On the fourth visit, Dorian told her everything. Not because he had decided to trust her completely, but because 6 years of carrying it alone had worn something down inside him. And there was something about saying it to the person whose name was on the company that felt like finally handing the weight back to someone who had the capacity to hold it. He told her about the morning he first noticed the fractures in the secondary support columns. He had been doing a standard walk-through early before the crews arrived, the way he always did. The cracks were subtle diagonal stress lines in the lower third of 3 adjacent columns, the kind that a less experienced eye might have read as superficial. Dorian had seen that pattern before on a job in Baltimore years earlier. He knew what it meant. He went back to the site trailer and wrote the report that same morning. 4 pages photographs attached. He submitted it through the project management system and sent a physical copy to the Regional Safety Board by certified mail. He kept a copy for himself at home because he had learned early in his career that paperwork had a way of disappearing when it became inconvenient. Then he waited for a response. The project manager, a man named Brett Calloway, called him into the trailer 2 days later and told him the columns had been reviewed by the company's internal engineering team and were within acceptable tolerance. No halt would be ordered. The timeline would continue. Dorian pushed back. He requested the internal review documents so he could compare their findings against his own. Calloway told him the review was proprietary. Dorian escalated to the regional director. The regional director didn't return his calls. 2 weeks later, the scaffolding came down. When the investigation started, Dorian told Celeste, his voice level and quiet. I went to get my copy of the report, the one I kept at home. He paused. It was gone. Someone had been in the house. Nothing else was touched, just the folder where I kept work documents. Celeste was very still. I told the investigators I had filed the report, he continued. They told me there was no record of it in the project management system. The certified mail receipt I had showed delivery, but the safety board said they had no record of receiving it. My copy was gone. He looked at his hands. Without the document, I was just a man claiming he had warned people, and the company had lawyers, and I had nothing. He told her about the months after the blacklisting, the suspended certification, the way job offers would materialize and then vanish once his name cleared a background check. He told her about Alina not in detail, because some things he still couldn't say out loud in their full shape, but enough. Enough for Celeste to understand that the harm hadn't stopped at his career. When he finished, the street outside was dimming into early evening. Marin had fallen asleep on the porch swing behind them, her homework still open across her lap. Celeste didn't offer condolences. She understood by now that he didn't want them. What he had just given her wasn't a bid for sympathy. It was testimony. "The memo I found in my father's safe," she said carefully. "He wrote it 3 days before the collapse. He told the project director to keep the timeline and adjust the documentation afterward." She paused. "He knew Dorian. He had your report. He read it and he chose to bury it." Dorian nodded slowly. He had suspected it for years. Suspicion and confirmation were different things, but he had lived so long with one that the other arrived without the release he might have expected. It didn't make him feel better. It made the shape of what had happened clearer. Sometimes clarity was all you could ask for. "What happens now?" he said. Celeste looked at him directly. "That depends on what you want to happen," she said. "This is your story. I won't tell it without your permission." 3 days after that conversation, a letter arrived at Dorian's house. It came in a plain white envelope with a return address he didn't recognize, a collections firm called Meridian Recovery Associates. The letter informed him that an outstanding legal fee of $14,000 related to administrative costs incurred during the East Vale safety investigation had been transferred to their agency for collection. Payment was due within 30 days. Failure to pay would result in a lien being placed on his property. Dorian read the letter twice at the kitchen table while Marin ate breakfast, then folded it carefully and put it in his back pocket. He didn't say anything to her. She was 8. She didn't need to know that the house she slept in was being used as a pressure point. He called Celeste from the backyard. She answered on the first ring. When he read her the letter, there was a silence on her end that told him she hadn't known about it and that she understood immediately what it was. "That's not a legitimate debt," she said. "There were no administrative fees assessed against you during the investigation. I've read every document from that proceeding. I know it's not legitimate," Dorian said. "That's not the point. I can have this dissolved within a week. I'll have my attorney contact the collections firm directly." "No," he said. The word came out harder than he intended. He softened it slightly. "No, I don't want you paying off threats made against me by your company's people. That's not how this works, Dorian. If you pay it, then every time I look at this house, I'll know it was saved by Roar money. I can't live in that." He paused. "And I can't let Marin grow up in it." Celeste was quiet for a moment. "I understand," she said finally. "I won't touch it." But the letter changed something between them. Not because of the money, because of what it revealed about the other side's willingness to use Marin's home as a weapon. Dorian had understood abstractly that reopening the East Vale case would provoke a response. He understood it concretely now. He began to pull back. He didn't cancel their next porch conversation, but he was quieter during it, more measured. He answered Celeste's questions with shorter responses and didn't volunteer anything beyond what she directly asked. Celeste noticed but didn't press. She waited the way she had learned to wait with him. Finally, he said it plainly. "You can walk away from this, Celeste. Not easily, maybe, but you can. You're young. You're capable. You have resources. If Roar Meridian falls apart, you rebuild somewhere else under a different name. People like you always have a next chapter. That's true," she said. "I don't have a next chapter," he said. "I have this house and I have Marin. If we go through with this and it fails, if they bury it again, if the board wins, and the documentation gets suppressed a second time, I lose the house. I lose whatever credibility I've managed to piece back together. And Marin grows up watching her father get destroyed twice by the same family." He looked at her steadily. I need you to understand that before we go any further. This isn't symmetrical. What you're risking and what I'm risking are not the same thing." Celeste held his gaze and didn't offer a reassurance she couldn't guarantee. "I know," she said. "I know they're not the same." They sat with that for a while. Then Dorian stood up, told her he needed to think, and went inside. Celeste drove back across the city in the dark, and for the first time since she had opened her father's safe, she wasn't certain she had the right to ask this man for anything at all. 2 days later, Dorian called Celeste and asked her to come to Maple Row one last time. She arrived at the usual hour. The afternoon light was flat and gray, the kind that made everything look slightly smaller than it was. Marin was inside. For the first time since Celeste had started coming, the porch was empty. No homework spread across the swing, no glass of water appearing from small, serious hands. Just Dorian standing at the top of the steps with his arms crossed and something final in his posture. He didn't sit down. Neither did she. "I've thought about it," he said, "and I can't do it." Celeste waited. "It's not that I don't believe you," he continued. "I believe the folder is real. I believe the memo is real. I believe you mean what you say about wanting to make it right." He paused. "But meaning it and being able to do it are two different things. And the cost of trying and failing falls on me and Marin, not on you." "I know that," Celeste said. "I don't think you know it the way I know it," he said, not unkindly. "You know it intellectually. You've thought about it, weighted included it in your calculations, but you haven't lived the version where everything goes wrong and there's nothing left." He looked at her directly. "I have, and I won't put Marin through that." Celeste didn't argue. She had promised herself she would never push him towards something he hadn't chosen freely, and she meant to keep that promise, even now when keeping it felt like watching something necessary slip away. "I understand. She said you're not a bad person. Dorian said I want to be clear about that. What you're trying to do, I think it comes from a real place. But the road to where my family ended up was also paved by people who thought they were doing something real. He let that settle. I can't afford another real intention that doesn't hold." Celeste nodded. There was nothing adequate to say, so she didn't try to say it. She walked back to her car. She sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Through the windshield. Maple Row looked exactly the way it always had worn, functional, indifferent to the dramas of people passing through it. She had come here believing that doing the right thing was its own kind of protection. That truth presented clearly enough was sufficient armor. Dorian had just explained to her with more patience than she deserved why that belief was a luxury. She drove back to her apartment on the other side of the city and sat at her kitchen table with her father's folder open in front of her. The memo was on top. 3 sentences in Victor Rohr's handwriting signed with his initials ordering a cover-up that had cost a man his career, his wife, and 6 years of his life. If she put the folder back in the safe, closed it, and moved forward, running Rohr Meridian the way the board expected her to, she would be doing exactly what her father had done. Not in the same way, but in the same direction. She sat with that for a long time. Then her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Dorian. 4 words. "Don't leave yet. Please." Celeste stared at the message. She read it 3 times. Then she set the folder aside, picked up her keys, and drove back across the city toward Maple Row, without allowing herself to think too carefully about what those 4 words had caused him to send. Dorian was sitting on the porch steps when she pulled up. It was past 9 o'clock. The street was quiet, the way Maple Row got quiet at night. Not peaceful exactly, but settled. Everyone retreated behind their own doors and their own problems. A single streetlight cast a pale circle on the sidewalk. Dorian had a mug of coffee in both hands and was looking at nothing in particular when Celeste parked and walked up the path. She sat down on the steps without being invited. He didn't object. They sat in silence for a moment. "Marin asked me something tonight," he said finally. While I was putting her to bed, he looked down at the mug. "She asked me why I never talk about the bridge. She said she heard Leon Vance mentioned Eastville to his wife at the grocery store once, and she knew it was about me, and she's been waiting for me to bring it up myself. He paused. She's 8 years old, and she's been protecting me from a conversation she thought I wasn't ready to have. Celeste didn't say anything. I've spent 6 years making decisions based on protecting her, Dorian said. And it turns out she's been doing the same thing for me. He finally looked up. I don't want her to grow up thinking that's what love requires, that you protect the people you love by staying silent about the things that hurt you. He set the mug down on the step beside him. So tell me what you found, he said. All of it. Whatever else is in that folder that you haven't shown me yet. Celeste reached into the bag she had brought and removed a manila envelope. Inside was a USB drive and 2 printed documents. The first document was the independent structural assessment commissioned by the city engineer. 4 pages confirming the stress fractures Dorian had identified, recommending immediate construction suspension dated 14 days before the scaffolding collapse. It had never been entered into the official investigation file. Dorian read it slowly. His hands were steady. The second document was a chain of internal emails between Victor Rohr and Warren Keene dated in the week following the collapse, discussing how to manage the investigation and which external contacts at the regulatory board could be relied upon to keep the review contained. Dorian read that one twice. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Then Celeste handed him a small portable speaker and connected the USB drive. There's an audio file, she said quietly. My father recorded some of his calls. I don't know if he did it habitually or only selectively, but this one exists. She pressed play. Victor Rohr's voice filled the quiet porch. Low measured the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. He was speaking to Brett Calloway, the project manager. The call was dated 4 days before the collapse. Victor told Calloway to keep the crews on schedule. He said the column assessment had been handled internally and the findings were acceptable. When Calloway mentioned that the safety supervisor had escalated his concerns to the regional board, Victor said, "That's been managed. If anything happens on site, we document it as an equipment failure. The supervisor's report doesn't exist officially, so it can't be cited. Make sure Keene knows the timeline on the filing." The recording ended. The street was completely silent. Dorian sat motionless for a long moment. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at the streetlight at the end of the path, and then he looked at his hands, and then he looked at the speaker sitting on the porch step between them. "He heard me," Dorian said finally. His voice was very quiet. He read the report. He knew exactly what I had found, and he buried it anyway. "Yes," Celeste said. "And 4 days later, 4 men got hurt." "Yes." Dorian was silent for a long time. Then he said, "What do we do with this?" Celeste looked at him steadily. "Whatever you decide," she said. "I meant that the first day, and I mean it now." Dorian took 3 days. He didn't speak to Celeste during that time. He went to work, picked Marin up from school, made dinner, helped with homework, and sat with the weight of what he had heard on that porch recording until he understood exactly what he was willing to do and what he was willing to risk. On the 3rd morning, he called Celeste and said 4 words. "Let's do it right." They agreed on a press conference, not a corporate statement filtered through Rohr Meridian's communications department. Not a legal filing buried in court documents that the press would have to excavate. A direct public statement on the record with the evidence presented in full. Celeste would speak as a private individual, not as CEO. She retained a media attorney to advise on the process, but made clear the statement would be hers alone in her own words, without corporate varnish. The morning of the press conference, Warren Keene called Celeste 4 times. She let each call go to voicemail. The board sent a formal written request that she postpone. She replied with a single sentence. "The postponement window has closed." The conference was held in a mid-sized meeting room at a downtown hotel neutral ground. No Rohr Meridian branding anywhere. 14 journalists attended in person. Several local television stations sent cameras. Dorian arrived with Marin and sat in the back row against the wall close to the door. Celeste stood at the front of the room without notes. She spoke for 22 minutes. She described finding the safe opening the folder reading the memo. She described hiring a private document examiner to verify the materials. She described the chain of emails between her father and Warren Keene. She played the audio recording through the room's speaker system, and the room went completely still when Victor Rohr's voice said, "The supervisor's report doesn't exist officially, so it can't be cited." Then she presented 3 items as formal evidence: Dorian's original warning report, the independent city engineer's structural assessment, and the audio file. She stated clearly without legal hedging that Dorian Price had identified the structural problem at Eastdale, had filed a proper report through correct channels, and had been deliberately removed from the official record to protect the company's timeline and financial standing. She stated that her father had read the report, understood its implications, and chosen to suppress it. She stated that the resulting investigation had been conducted on a falsified evidentiary foundation. She did not apologize on behalf of Rohr Meridian. She did not use the word mistakes. She did not say missteps or oversights or any of the other words corporations use to describe deliberate decisions they wished to reframe as accidents. She said, "My father made a choice. It was a wrong choice made with full awareness of its consequences for another person and his family. I am here because that choice has to be named for what it was." When she finished, a journalist near the front asked if Dorian Price wished to make a statement. Dorian stood up from the back row. He walked to the front of the room slowly, and Marin watched him from her seat against the wall, with her hands folded in her lap. He stood beside Celeste and looked out at the cameras and the journalists, and the recording devices pointed at him, and he felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a kind of solidity. The ground under him felt level for the first time in a long time. He said, "I did my job. I identified a problem. I documented it. I reported it through every proper channel available to me. What happened after that was not my failure. I spent 6 years carrying a name that didn't belong to me. Today, I just want the record to reflect what actually happened." He paused for a moment, then added, "I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here because my daughter is sitting in the back of this room, and I want her to know that the truth is worth saying out loud, even when it costs something." He walked back to his seat. Marin looked up at him when he sat down. She didn't say anything. She reached over and put her hand on top of his and left it there. At the corner grocery on Maple Row, Leon Vance stood in front of the small television mounted above the register and watched the press conference feed on the local news channel. When Dorian finished speaking, Leon reached up and turned the volume higher so that everyone in the store could hear. He didn't say anything to the other customers. He didn't explain or justify it. He just made sure they could all hear the man he had doubted stand up and tell the truth. The response was not immediate, and it was not clean. Rohr Meridian issued a statement within 2 hours of the press conference calling the evidence selectively presented and the audio recording unverified. Warren Keene appeared on a local business news segment that evening and used the word context 17 times in 8 minutes. The board voted to place Celeste on administrative leave pending an internal review of her conduct, but the documents were already public. The audio file had already been downloaded and shared and verified by 3 independent forensic audio firms within 48 hours, each confirming the recording's authenticity. 2 former Rohr Meridian employees contacted the media independently with their own accounts of the East Vale investigation. A regional investigative journalist obtained the certified mail receipt showing Dorian's original report had been delivered to the safety board and obtained the internal board memo instructing staff to log it as undeliverable. The story didn't stay local. Within a week, a state-level oversight committee announced it was opening an independent review of the Eastville investigation and 3 other infrastructure projects completed by Rohr Meridian in the same period. Warren Keene retained personal legal counsel. 2 board members quietly resigned. Dorian's professional record was formally corrected through the state licensing authority 6 weeks after the press conference. His certifications were reinstated with a written acknowledgement that the original suspension had been based on falsified documentation. The collections notice from Meridian Recovery Associates was voided. The threatened lien on his house was dissolved. No payment was ever required. Celeste used a portion of her personal assets to establish the East Vale Labor Trust, a fund designated to support workers who had been displaced or harmed by Rohr Meridian projects over the preceding decade. She did not name the fund after herself or after her father. She named it after the bridge that had started everything because she believed the place where something went wrong should be remembered, not erased. She resigned from Roar Meridian 3 months after the press conference. The board had made it clear the administrative leave would become permanent termination if she didn't resign first. She resigned first on her own terms and released a brief public statement that said, "Only I was not willing to inherit what my father built without accounting for how he built it." She spent the following months working with a small team to establish a new development consultancy focused on community infrastructure projects with labor transparency and independent safety oversight written into every contract from the beginning. It was smaller than anything the ROR name had ever been attached to. She found she didn't mind. 4 months after the press conference, Dorian accepted a position as a senior safety consultant with a mid-sized construction firm that had followed the East Vale story closely and reached out through a mutual contact. The offer came with a straightforward note. "We looked at your original report. You were right. We'd like someone like you on our team." He accepted. On a Saturday morning in early spring, Celeste held a small dedication ceremony for the first project completed under her new consultancy, a community recreation center in the Eastbrook neighborhood 2 miles from Maple Row. Dorian had consulted on the safety specifications for the foundation. He arrived with Marin, who wore a yellow jacket, and immediately began inspecting the building's exterior with the focused attention of someone conducting an official assessment. Celeste stood with Dorian outside the entrance as the small crowd of neighborhood residents moved through the new space. Marin came back from her inspection, stood in front of them, and looked up at the building with her arms crossed the way she had seen her father stand 100 times on a job site. "Is the debt paid? Now?" she asked. She wasn't asking it lightly. She wanted to know. Dorian looked at Celeste. Celeste looked at Marin. "Not entirely," Dorian said. "Some things can't be fully paid, but we're not carrying it for someone else anymore." Marin considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and ran toward the building's entrance to investigate the interior. Dorian and Celeste followed, behind them. Maple Row was 2 miles away, and the morning was clear, and the ground under their feet was level. Some debts can't be settled with money. They can only be paid with truth. And truth, when it's long overdue, costs something real from everyone who touches it. Dorian didn't win because someone finally felt guilty. He won because one person chose courage over comfort, and he chose the same. That's what this story is really about. Not the powerful woman who came to apologize, but 2 ordinary people who decided that silence in the end was a price neither of them could keep paying. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that integrity matters even when no one is watching, and that the truth deserves to be said out loud even when it's difficult, then you're exactly who this channel is made for. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. There are more stories like this one waiting for you here, and every single one of them is worth your time.